much to talk about, I thought we'd start with just talking about the euro. And it became the official currency for the EU in 1999. And while it seems to have been a very logical step in the integration of European Union countries, and it seems to have been made with like the best intentions, it may have been a little too ambitious. And that, I think, is one of the biggest problems with just the structure of the EU. And it was clear that these countries did not constitute an optimal currency area because they were just so different. And even though they had this single currency monetary system, they still had all these different fiscal policies that we've been talking about, various levels of government spending and taxing, and a single monetary policy was much more likely to amplify rather than diminish all their fundamental differences, especially between countries like Germany, which were very productive, and the slightly more efficient and productive periphery countries. Now, there was convergence criteria for joining the EMU, which is the European Monetary Union. It specified that a country could only join if its deficit was less than 3% of its GDP and its public debt was less than 60%. But even when this was turned into a permanent set of rules with the Growth and Stability Act, there was no way to enforce this, and pretty much nobody followed this. So countries were just entering, even though they really weren't able to, even though they were just so completely different. Still, they did this euro, they put it in place, and there were a lot of skeptics. But at first, debt lowered, the interest rates converged, and it seemed like, oh, well, maybe this is a good idea. And but there were problems, and the problems didn't come to the surface, but they did kind of reveal themselves when Greece came out. Citizens of individual countries were expected to vote EU-friendly as long as they expected that their standard of living while they were in the EU would stay like a good standard of living, or that it would improve. But unfortunately, the standard of living in some countries like Greece was directly subsidized by governments in the form of subsidizing businesses and the wealthy with low taxes, and keeping the masses happy with big benefits and large public sector spending. Now, in October 2009, there was a new Greek government elected, and it said that their budget deficit was in fact 12% of its GDP, which is more than 3 times, 3.7% promised to the European Commission at the beginning of 2009. So this leaves people wondering, how could a country that was so closely tied and so tightly intertwined with all these other countries, it was constrained by all these countries in the trading sphere, how could they have been allowed to wander so far off the path of fiscal responsibility? And the answer, there's not really a solid answer, but the answer kind of to this is that there is no mechanism in place to keep countries from overspending. So these countries were so close that Greece, which is only 1/40th of the total Eurozone economy, hit these problems, it started to threaten the entire currency union. Well, the countries of the EU had no choice but to succumb to this bailout, because if one country were to spout out into recession or a depression, it would just take the rest of the countries along with it. There was no way for one country to be by itself in a recession. We kind of know why, because they have no ability to control their own currency, and we've talked about that a lot. However, this bailout created serious problems of its own. For starters, it exposed some weaknesses in the EU, and it showed that an attempt to fix the situation might not always create the desired result. And there's a quote up here that says, Greece's liabilities are far in excess of its economic capacity to repay, with the limited likelihood of strong economic growth, low nominal interest rates, or sustained primary fiscal surplus preventing the government from diluting the debt burden. Which basically means, they talked about it, there's really no way for Greece to repay its debt. So he did this whole bailout package, but it might not even, was it really even worth it, is the question that ends with this bailout package for Greece. If this plan was only going to push back the recognition of liabilities, then it might not even have been worth its trouble. And there were also other important consequences, like we talked about, with other countries suffering alongside with Greece, and now these other countries like Portugal, Spain, and just regular other countries in the EU had to deal with decreases in their own investment levels, as well as new straining regulation over their levels of spending. You can kind of imagine the Euro system as a domino set, where the first domino is Greece, which owes nearly $10 billion to Portuguese banks, Portugal owes $86 billion to banks in Spain. Ireland is heavily indebted to Germany and Britain, and the exposure of German banks to Spanish debt totals $238 billion. So basically, no country can be alone in its financial suffering. And these kind of issues show that the bailout is not the solution to all these financial woes, and it also shows that it can't fix this inherently problematic system. And personally, I think that's where the whole problem is, that the system is inherently problematic, and it's not just countries overspending, it's that they're tied too closely together, they're too different, and that they never really should have been a European monetary union in the first place with these countries. But also I have another unintended consequence, and it's kind of the erosion of European Union unity, especially in the case of Greece. And you can kind of tell in this picture in the background, it was from an article in The Economist that said, let the Greeks bury themselves, or something like that, I read a while ago, but that's the chancellor, and she's just watching like Greece fall. I mean, Greeks did not want to bail out. Germans did not want to bail out Greeks. And actually, an opinion poll indicated that over 60% of German citizens were firmly opposed to an EU-led bailout of Greece, with nearly 40% of those surveyed stating that Greece would be better off if Germany were not part of the euro area. So there's a lot of disunity in the European Union over this. And in conclusion, there's been a long, complicated road to the bailout, and it didn't achieve a perfect outcome. But I mean, the euro's still alive, so I don't want to leave anybody feeling too depressed. Hopefully they'll get through this and achieve financial security and stability.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Let's see if there are any questions here or comments on the presentation. Alex?
I actually have a two-part question. First of all, do you know why there was no system in place to enforce the spending, or did the governments just kind of like trust each other? And are there currently any new programs that are on the way to provide mechanisms? Yeah.
Well, so the first part, government spending is a fiscal policy, and countries themselves they always want tight control over their own fiscal policies. And that's like a big problem with it, because you need fiscal and monetary policy to be similar. But the EMU did not control their fiscal policies, which is their government spending. So there were no mechanisms. And I'm not sure if they really trust each other more than nobody was going to allow for the EU to have one fiscal policy. And there are no mechanisms in place currently for this. Maybe there will be in the future.
I mean, it just seems like with the current crisis, it seems like it'd sort of be a kick in the pants to realize, okay, we need to watch each other so this doesn't happen again.
Right, and they're not doing that. And I think a lot of them are they don't want to put in place all these like strains on their spending right now in this bad situation. Nobody wants to make it even harder for their countries, but I mean, it does seem like that's what they should do.
I'll just ask one question. Just to play devil's advocate, I can see definitely what you're talking about, the potential risk that even the bailout doesn't work and only prolongs the reckoning. But on the other hand, if you allow collapse, that has enormous costs as well. And if you plunge countries into sort of a depression, then the overall cost in the long term is even greater than it would have been without a bailout.
Right.
So,
I mean, a bailout, I'm not saying that it's not worth it. It definitely is. But it could have been avoided if they weren't in this, if these countries were not all put together in this European monetary system. They were the wrong countries to be put. They were too diverse, too different. And if this wasn't happening right now, like Greece would still be spending and stuff, but there probably wouldn't have been a crisis, because all this exposure, all this like, oh, they're not going to bail them out, oh, they might, and then interest rates get high, all this is what caused the problem, and it never would have happened if they weren't all put together.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so let me just see if there are any other questions. Is anybody else? Okay, so Alex, room for one more question then.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, you do feel that the current financial crisis poses a serious threat to the EU? And do you feel like it's going to end up destroying the Eurozone?
I can only hope. It's gonna help. I
Oh my
mean, I
goodness.
would, I'm not sure, I mean, well, that's
That's fine.
but honestly, I don't really think that the euro is like a good structure for all these countries. I think that the stronger countries like Germany, Sweden, could, and we read an article about this, how they could make like a different zone and make a stronger currency, make it like so that it's competitive with the dollar, so that there's something maybe we call it the euro too or something. And then the other countries should revert back to their own currencies, or maybe I'm not sure, 100% sure what they should do, but I don't think that all these countries should stay together. But I don't think there's going to be a collapse.
Great. Well, thank you. Okay, well, so our final speaker for today then will be Heather.